Okay, hello and welcome. This is chapter 3 of Hunters Point and Long Island City Through the Ages, our video tour being put on by Hunters Point Parks Conservancy with our tour guide, Andrew Capuchinas. If you haven't seen chapters 1 or 2 yet, check them out on our YouTube channel, Hunters Point Parks Conservancy, to get yourself up to speed before checking out chapter 3 here today. Again, this is being put on by the Hunters Point Parks Conservancy. We're a nonprofit group in Long Island City that works to preserve and enhance our waterfront parks, Gantry Plaza State Park and Hunters Point South Park. To learn more, you can check out our website, hunterspointparks.org. We are thankful to have Andrew Capuchinas being our guide for this 5-part series, Hunters Point and Long Island City Through the Ages. Andrew is a local resident who's also a member of the New York Map Society, and very knowledgeable about all things maps and Long Island City history. Today, chapter 3, 19th century and the Industrial Revolution and LIC. So we're looking forward to learning about that time period. Andrew, take it away.
Well, thank you, Casey, and thank you everyone for joining us. I hope you've enjoyed the previous 2 parts and that you'll return for the 4th part later on. The tour starts with the War of 1812, when the federal government built defensive forts at the entrance to New York City through Long Island Sound. So they were afraid of British ships coming in through the Sound and attacking lower Manhattan. And so there were forts and blockhouses built. Fort Stevens was built at the very northern part of today's Astoria. You'll see in that image of Fort Stevens, just above it, there's a little fort, and then you see a larger image of Mill Rock. And so that was like basically a lookout tower looking for British ships. There is also a tower built at Hallets Point, and you'll see on that map on the left that there was even a blockhouse above Newtown Creek. Now remember these 3 locations because you're going to see them on maps decades later, even though all of these were abandoned by 1815. I've tried to find remnants of the Fort Stevens, and the only thing that's at that end of Astoria today is the Whitey Ford ball field. Now, Long Island shore development proceeded rather slowly. It was, even though it was right across the river from Manhattan, it was relatively isolated. And there were abundant marshes all over, making travel difficult. There was no easy access to the town seat, Newtown, 4 miles away. So in 1781, there were only 2 homes near the shore, and only 1 more was added by the 1820s. I've put in a red marker on a contemporary map so that you see where that oldest shoreline home was in Long Island City. Today's approximately 43rd Road and Vernon Boulevard. The Paint Tar Farm.
That's wild. One home added in 50 years versus the 10,000 a year that we have now. So how things change.
That's pretty slow.
Yeah.
You'll see why as we look at the maps, and you'll see that there's just nothing there. There's marshes, salt marshes, no roads to speak of.
Yeah, but now we're the fastest growing neighborhood in the country, so quite different.
All right. So here we're going to the mid-1830s, and you'll see I put up for comparison an 1832 map and an 1836 map. And on both of them, you see Fort Stevens at Hallets Point. You see Mill Rock off into the middle of the Hell Gate. And the Hell Gate has nothing to do with hell. It's a corruption of a Dutch phrase that just meant light, an area of light. And you also see on the 1832 map, they still had the tower, even though it had been abandoned more than 15 years earlier. But you also see on the 1836 map, all of a sudden, there's a road. There's a road to the ferry that goes to 86th Street in Manhattan. And there are laid out plots of land, farms, and some homes. Whereas in the 1832 version, there's no construction or development at all. You still see a marsh at the lower end of Hallets Cove. At the southern end of today's Long Island City, on the 1832 map, it was Bennett's Point. By 1836, it's been renamed Hunter's Point, and that happened because Captain George Hunter married Jacob Bennett's daughter. And it was at this point that farms and mansions, most notably one by John Jacob Astor, were lining Newtown Creek shores. It was a very bucolic area, chock full of wildlife, fish, oysters, clams, all sorts of interesting wildlife. On this 1844 map, I noticed a label for Corporation Farms. And when I looked that up, it turned out that in 1831, New York City bought a lot of land in that area in today's Long Island City for a planned asylum and home for pauper children, along with a junior farm that they intended to be worked by the children to cover some expenses. And they built structures, which you can see on the map, those squares. There was a boys' nursery, a girls' nursery, a schoolhouse, and an infants' nursery. 80% of the children there were under 10. Imagine them working the farm, and 72% were boys. The institution moved in 1845, first to Blackwell's Island, which is today's Roosevelt Island, and then it eventually got a more permanent home on Randall's Island. New York City auctioned off the land that actually spurred development. You can see, by the way, near the southern end of Hunters Point South, there was a structure, and that was part of the Hunters Point estate, and more on that later. 1835, the Reverend Eliphalet Knott, famous as the longtime president of Union College in Schenectady, was a big-time land speculator and developer. He partnered with the steamboat builder Neziah Bliss, and later with his own nephew, Henry Annibal, to develop waterfront real estate in Hunters Point South. And they bought farms, including the Hunter Estate and what would become Blissville. Charles Ely, that name might be familiar to you because of a subway station, and Jonathan Crane, and you see his name along with the notation 136 acres of marshland, partnered with Knott and Annabelle to grade and level Hunters Point. The first buildings on the north side of what was originally Blissville Road, now Borden Avenue, went up in 1854. George Gibbs, who was owner of one of the 3 original houses near the shoreline, had a vision for developing an upscale area along the shore, mansions with private gardens and a view of Manhattan. I mean, this was 1840, and they called it Ravenswood. An access road was built, originally Astoria Turnpike, later became Vernon Avenue. And the sale of corporation farms by the city was what let development proceed. In 1852, there was the newspaper, the Gazette, trumpeted progress at the site. And I wanted to read to you a little bit about what they said about the development. And I quote, "Buildings are going up in every direction and much taste is manifested by the owners in arranging and decorating their grounds. John Williams of the firm of Williams and Stevens, wholesale looking glass manufacturers, contracted with Mr. Whitney for construction of a seawall 12 feet high on the shore of the East River, fronting his grounds. A terrace is to run along the waterfront, giving a beautiful promenade 6 feet wide. Mr. Williams has 4 houses in process of erection, which when completed will command a beautiful prospect as the ground shelves off gradually to the river on one side and the Astoria Turnpike on the other. He's also contracted for the erection of 3 other buildings at a short distance from the embankment." The map on the right shows those plots of land opposite their view actually of Blackwell's Island was a penitentiary, Blackwell's Penitentiary. More on that later. So the mansions were built, landscape trees and gardens, and the owners strolled on the promenade. A trolley line was built on Vernon Avenue, but things change. Eventually, the well-to-do left. The mansions were converted to offices and factories, most notably the New York Architectural Terracotta Company, which survived very late and was at the foot of the new 59th Street Bridge. Further north at Hallets Cove, here's a map that was titled Map of 465 Valuable Building Lots in the Village of Astoria, Long Island. It was Hallets Cove. The developer named the area Astoria after John Jacob Astor, hoping he'd finance a new seminary. Instead, Astor gave just $500. The 1850s saw commercial and industrial development along Newtown Creek accelerate for a number of reasons. It was the cost of the land was very low. Ships were able to sail upstream. It was remote from populated areas, but probably most important, it was remote from the regulations that were in force in Manhattan. Regulations, it was pretty much a free-for-all in Queens and in Brooklyn. And there were whale oil refineries, glue factories, tin and chemical works, alcohol distilleries. And by the way, the alcohol wasn't necessarily for drinking liquor, but it was a component of a liquid called camphene, which was a cheaper alternative to whale oil. And all this development displaced the farms and the homes that were already there. In 1854, the very first US kerosene refinery was built right off Newtown Creek at that red circle. Now, kerosene originally, which had been around since the 1840s, was manufactured from coal tar and shale oils. But when E.L. Drake drilled his first well in Pennsylvania in 1859, petroleum became the primary source of kerosene, which was much, much cheaper than whale oil. Whale oil for lighting became the province of the wealthy. It cost more than 10 times more than kerosene did. I want to mention that I mentioned glue factories. One of my earliest memories of living near Newtown Creek was sitting on the stoop on Greenpoint Avenue, right near the bridge over the creek, and watching horse carts drag dead horses by the nose across the river into Brooklyn, where there was a big time glue factory. I never forgot that.
Wow, what a gruesome sight. So you mentioned that, there was different regulations in this spot than in Manhattan, because at this point they were not under the same jurisdiction. Is that correct?
That's right. It wasn't part of New York City.
Wow. Sure, we'll learn
It
a little bit
wasn't
about
even,
that later.
there wasn't even a Long Island city. It was basically villages that were not incorporated. They were not together. And there really was very rudimentary, there were rudimentary regulations governing commercialization. In fact, everybody wanted more factories. Everyone was constantly promoting the area of Newtown Creek and southern Long Island City and Greenpoint as an ideal place for a factory. Come on down and do whatever you want, dump all your garbage and right into the river.
What a shame for us
The
now.
next set of maps, you'll see the difference in the depiction of the area around Newtown Creek from 1852 to 1859, just 7 years. And all of a sudden, you've got lots of names, houses, and those are people who owned land. The Van Pelts, the Painters, the Halts, the Tottens. Hunters Point is now officially a label there, and Hunters Point with an apostrophe. Maps for the last 150 years sometimes have an apostrophe, sometimes they don't. Hunters Point Parks chose not to use it. It doesn't seem to be anything other than a random decision. One of the big changes you'll notice is that rail line along the northern border of Newtown Creek. That was the Flushing Railroad Company, the very first railroad in Western Queens. It was opened in 1854, running east from Hunters Point, right along the creek, all the way to Blissville, and then there was a spur north to Flushing. And at the end of at the East River end of the Flushing Railroad was a ferry landing to 34th Street, which began in 1859. A lot of things happened in the 1860s, and I've just had a summary here. Jackson Avenue opened up, and all of a sudden, all the wagons and carriages from Elmhurst and Flushing to Hunters Point and the ferry terminals ended up at Hunters Point. There was a Long Island Railroad depot added in 1861 to the Flushing Railroad depot. And all of a sudden, Hunters Point started an explosion of hotels, saloons, restaurants, boarding houses. I'm sure houses of ill repute, coal and lumber yards. A newspaper started in 1865. In 1869, a new canal, Annabelle, or the 11th Street Basin. And you remember that was the nephew of the Reverend Knott of the Long Island City South. 1870, finally, Ravenswood, Steinway, Astoria, Newtown, Dutch Kills, and Blissville got together and incorporated into Long Island City with a total of somewhere between 12 and 15,000 residents. But 10 years later, the mayor is convicted of nearly bankrupting Long Island City by embezzlement. The city had not paid teachers, firemen, or police for months because Long Island City ran out of money. So everyone was in favor of being annexed by New York City in 1898. This is a contemporary aerial view, but showing the oil refineries that were added beginning in 1867. Astro Oil Works in Brooklyn on the East River, but you'll see in Long Island City, Hunters Point, Empire Oil, Standard Oil, lots of oil companies. And of course, we'll be talking in the 20th century episode, the culmination of lax security and controls of commercialization of Newtown Creek by it becoming essentially a sewer. But with 50 oil refineries opening along Newtown Creek, it became, for its size, the busiest river in the United States.
That's 50 different companies?
50 different oil refineries, some multiple
Remarkable.
from the same company, but that was the place to be.
Remarkable.
You can see them pumping out smoke, and there was a tremendous amount of noise and smells. And that's another thing that I remember from living in Blissville in the early 50s. But because of all that commercialization, thousands of people came to work in Long Island City and Greenpoint. In fact, in 1870, and this was New York City, and this is before Queens and Brooklyn were part of New York City, they were concerned about the smelly conditions in Midtown Manhattan. And the Board of Health sent officials to Brooklyn along the Newtown Creek, and they smelled to try to figure out where these smells were coming from. And they kind of seated the pants, maybe they wet their finger and put it in the air to see where it was going. All I did to this map was make the lines on this map red so that you can see where the smells went. And of course, where did they go? Hunters Point South. And of course, Manhattan's regulations led all of anything that was generated a smell, and whether it was a fat rendering work or homes for the manure that was gathered every night from the horses in Manhattan, wound up along Newtown Creek. Here's a map of Long Island City and titled Hunters Point from 1873. And I've put up both the large map, the whole map on the right, which I've turned so that because it was horizontal originally, and I've turned it on its side so that you can see the Annabelle Basin. But north of that, Empire Oil Works, Standard Oil, Charles Pratt's Oil Work, and that's the same Charles Pratt that founded Pratt Institute. You see multiple Standard Oil locations. You see lower down property of Union College. That was still the Reverend Knott, that developer. And that's the northern part of the map. The central part of the map, you'd see Captain Tyson Shipyard. And of course, by the way, you'll see the street numbers have nothing to do with what's there today. West 7th, West 6th, West 5th, West 4th. I happen to live on West 4th, which today is 50th Avenue. And what is that running north and south? West Street, and that's today's 5th Street. And one north-south street to the right, Central Avenue, is a previous name for Vernon Avenue. And the southernmost part of that map shows all of these plots laid out, very optimistically laid out, hoping for both residential and commercial sales. And you'll see the ferry landing to 34th Street and a canal and a Long Island Railroad depot.
It's just interesting that that's basically where the ferry currently is today, the NYC ferry to 34th Street also. It's very interesting.
It's been there for a very long time.
Yeah. It's also, looking, you have 3rd and 2nd, and then it changes to the name streets, but no 1st Street. Noticing that as well.
I think their 1st Street might have been there before they built the canal and before the railroad was there.
It became the ferry stop.
Yeah, I think these names, these numbers and names were thank you to the Reverend Knott and his nephew Annabelle. So some early photographs of the area. The Long Island Railroad was where the manure came, the night carts, carting away all the horse manure from the horse-drawn wagons in Manhattan. Where did they bring the manure? They brought it to Long Island City and Newtown Creek. And you can imagine what it smelled like, and both for the people working in those areas, but living nearby. And you see the masted schooners in the distance. There's also Long Island Railroad's refuse dump on Newtown Creek. It was New York City, before New York City was there, it was New York City's garbage dump. And I'm ending today's presentation with a December 31st, 1900 map, the end of the 19th century, showing what was now titled the First Ward of the Borough of Queens, formerly New York City. And you'll see there some updated street names. The ferry to 34th Street is at the end of Borden Avenue. You'll see Jackson Avenue intersecting with Vernon Avenue. You see Hunters Point Avenue, but the numbered streets are still there. 4th Street is still there instead of 50th Avenue. And instead of 5th Street, it's still West Street. And you've got a park there at 11th Street. 11th Street was pretty much where 48th Avenue is today, but we'll more on that next time around. I hope you've enjoyed this tour of 19th century Long Island City, and that you'll join us for part 4, 20th century development and decline of Long Island City South and Newtown Creek, only of course to bloom in the 21st century. Thank you.
Yes, but in a different way. Yeah, so that was fascinating. Obviously, a lot happened in the 19th century that changed the neighborhood significantly. I think clearly we can say that the oil refineries had some changed the neighborhood significantly. Not all for the better, especially looking back, sort of retrospectively on that. So for the 20th century, what are the things that you think people should be most excited about hearing about? Is there 1 or 2 items that are particularly relevant and important?
I think number 1 is understanding the rapid change thanks to finally being part of New York City, and that rapid change was the city passing laws and actually holding companies to account around Newtown Creek. And of course, probably the most significant thing that happened on Newtown Creek in the 20th century was a major oil spill found only by accident by a Coast Guard helicopter making a routine trip over Newtown Creek. Bridges being built. Um, there was a bridge over Newtown Creek where Vernon Avenue went right over into Brooklyn, where there's on the Brooklyn side there's a park. On the Long Island City side, we sure would like to have an open space area at the end of Vernon Avenue, and
Hmm.
it's like the city of New York isn't on board with that. But what we're talking about is people deciding that Hunters Point and Long Island City in general is a great place to live, and a lot of development and the beautification of what was formerly purely industrial, commercial, and residential for workers in the many factories in the area.
Yep, and that era gave us the beautiful park, at least the first parts of it that the Conservancy works in now, Gantry Plaza State Park, just at the end of the 20th century, 1998. So we'll touch on that a little, the Queens West development. So thank you, Andrew, again for being with us for this 5-part series. We're now 3 down. Next one is chapter 4, 20th century, which we're looking forward to hearing some more, and we hope you can join us for that as well. Once again, if you want to learn more about Hunters Point Parks Conservancy, check us out online, hunterspointparks.org. Thanks very much.